All right. Hello and welcome everyone to our discussion on the future of Russia. I'm Dave Lawler. I'm the world news editor for Axios. And thank you to CNAS for inviting Axios once again to partner with you for this great conference. We have a fantastic discussion for you today. We're taking on a debate that's really been looming out there since late February when Vladimir Putin decided to move into Ukraine and he was repelled from Kyiv. He was hit by stronger sanctions than many of us expected. And all of a sudden, this idea started to bubble up that maybe we'd overestimated the Russian threat. So we're going to interrogate those ideas today with an absolutely all-star panel. Eddie Fishman is an adjunct senior fellow at CNAS, where he focuses on the intersection of economics and national security. He's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and an adjunct professor at Columbia. And he previously served as an advisor to Secretary of State John Kerry on Europe and Eurasia. And while in the Obama administration, he also played a key role in developing international sanctions to respond to Russia's interventions in Ukraine. So Eddie's the perfect guy to help us with the sanctions piece of this puzzle about the future of Russia. Richard Connolly is director of the consultancy Eastern Advisory Group and an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. He specializes on the Russian economy. And he literally wrote the books on Russia's response to sanctions and the Russian economy. Those were the titles of the books. So Richard will tackle the future of the Russian economy and how it intersects with Russia's military capabilities. Mike Kofman is research program director in the Russia Studies program at CNA and a fellow at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. And if you're anything like me, he's also been an essential follow on Twitter during the war in Ukraine. He's the guy who every reporter covering this war, myself included, has turned to understand what's going on with Russia's military. So that's where he comes in to this discussion about the future of Russia. And Andrea Kendall-Taylor is a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at CNIS and an adjunct professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Prior to joining CNIS, she was Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. And before that, she was a senior Russia analyst at CIA. So she's going to look at the future of Russia's posture toward the U.S. And how we should think about Vladimir Putin's hold on power as well going forward. So with these four great panelists, we should get a well-rounded and nuanced perspective on where Russia stands today as a global power and also as a threat to the West and how that may or may not change going forward and coming out of the war in Ukraine. So to frame that discussion, I just want to take a quick look at where we are today. So Russia's military has clearly taken enormous losses in terms of troops and materiel over the past 3.5 months fighting in Ukraine, but it is making gradual progress in the Donbass, and Putin is always ready to remind us that he's sitting on a big pile of nuclear weapons. Russia's global reputation has taken a blow as a result of the war, though it might not be quite as significant as many Western policymakers perhaps hoped when you look at the number of leaders, particularly in the developing world, who are continuing to court close relations with Russia. And sanctions are clearly hampering Russia's economy, though for now, oil and gas prices are very high and Russia still has customers. And Putin has made, a strategic blunder in Ukraine, but he's also tightened his control of the media at home. And from what we can tell, at least sitting where I am in Washington, it seems that Russians may be rallying around the flag to a certain effect. So that brings us to the title of today's panel, Down But Not Out. And I do want to make this discussion as interactive as possible. So please submit your questions throughout using the chat, and I'll try to integrate them as we go once we get to the Q&A portion. But first, I'm going to turn it over to each of these experts for some opening remarks, starting with Eddie on the economics and the sanctions piece of this discussion. So over to you, Eddie.
Thanks so much, Dave. So sanctions will definitely set the bounds of what's possible for Russia's economy in the years to come. They will severely constrain Russia's ability to grow economically and to produce advanced technology. But the extent to which they curtail Russian power, which is really the topic we're discussing today, will hinge on what happens in the months ahead. Let me explain. So sanctions have been unprecedented in their speed and scale. Within just weeks of Putin's invasion, they intensified from about a 2 out of 10 in intensity to an 8 out of 10. But sanctions are not yet comprehensive. Most notably, they continue to permit Russia to earn billions selling oil, gas, and other commodities around the world. And at the current pace, Russia will earn nearly $300 billion selling energy this year, which is a significant increase actually from last year. The EU did recently announce an oil embargo, but it's not clear that this will actually eviscerate Russia's overall export revenues. This weakness in the sanctions, the weakness that allows Russia to continue to generate billions of dollars selling oil and gas, has led to a record first quarter current account surplus of more than $95 billion. And just for context, that is a threefold increase from last year's tally in the first quarter, which was about $28 billion. So I want to be clear, this doesn't mean that Putin's economy is in good shape. The GDP of Russia will contract by as much as 10% this year. Russia itself projects an 8% contraction. And Russia's imports of manufactured goods, which is a critical sort of metric, are declining precipitously, down 50% in March compared with preceding months. And this is not just from Western countries, and this is an important point. Even neutral and pro-Russian countries have decreased their import or exports to Russia by almost 50%. And that's largely because of the risk imposed by the really sweeping financial sanctions imposed by the West. All of that said, we have reached the limit of pressure that we can impose on Russia without aggressively targeting oil and gas sales. It's because energy is really the crux of Russia's economy, accounting for 50% of export revenues and as much as 40% of the budget. And so far, Western sanctions on Russia's oil exports have focused specifically on domestic embargoes. And this may make us feel good. It may make us feel good in the US or Europe, that we can morally state that we are not, will no longer be funding Putin's war sort of, implicitly through buying oil and gas. But unfortunately, oil is a commodity sold on global markets. And so far, Russia has been able to reroute its purchases to countries outside of the sanctions coalition. For instance, before the invasion, India imported effectively no oil from Russia. Today, it's getting about 20% of its oil imports from Russia, some 800,000 barrels per day. India has already bought more oil from Russia in 2022 than it did in all of 2021. China and Turkey, meanwhile, have also significantly increased their purchases of Russian oil, each by more than 50% from last year's tally. All of this underscores a key point. The main objective of Western sanctions, if they're really going to curtail Russian power, needs to be cutting revenue going into Russia, not oil flowing out. So how do we do this? It sounds hard, right? But actually, there's a precedent for a global strategy to cut a country's export revenues. And that was the global oil sanctions we imposed on Iran in the lead up to the JCPOA. And this sanctions regime was composed of two parts. First, it involved threatening secondary sanctions against buyers of Iranian oil, including buyers in places like China, unless they significantly reduce their purchases every 6 months. Something like this is possible against Russia, or potentially even better, and something maybe we'll talk about, would be instead of requiring volume reductions, you could require price reductions. You've heard of this concept of a price cap that could be imposed on Russian oil sales. The second piece of the Iran oil sanctions was requiring Iranian oil revenues to accrue in escrow accounts outside of Iran. This led to tens of billions of dollars of Iranian oil proceeds growing in accounts in places like China, India, and Turkey that could only be used for bilateral trade in non-sanctioned goods. A policy like this, again, is definitely possible against Russia, but we haven't done it yet. So why? Why haven't we done it yet? And the answer is that doing policies like this will require the West to make hard choices, specifically threatening sanctions against Chinese, Indian, Turkish companies, and other companies outside of the sanctions coalition. In other words, it would require the West to prioritize the Russian threat, potentially at the expense of other priorities. And I think this is the key question that's going to face Western sanctions in the weeks and months ahead, because I think absent this, there's going to remain a gaping hole in the sanctions program, and we're not going to get from that 8 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10, where we are with Iran. So to sum up, the current sanctions are here to stay. There will be no deus ex machina for Putin. As he did in my day in 2014, Putin is going to try to wait the West out. I don't suspect he's going to curtail his war in Ukraine in order to trade for sanctions. But this policy or this strategy of trying to wait the West out is going to fail again. I'm sure of this. I believe the West will stay unified. The biggest unanswered question is whether the West is willing to do what it takes to maximize sanctions and actually cut Russia's export revenues. If not, sanctions will limit Russia's capacity for growth, but they won't put hard constraints on Putin's foreign policy. And in that case, we may well see more adventurism from Moscow, not less, in the future.
Thanks so much, Eddie. And I think maybe we'll return to that idea of trying to wait the West out. But for now, let's turn to Richard for the impact of sanctions and export controls on Russia's defense industrial base.
Thanks, Dave. So in my short remarks, I'd like to address the question of whether the impact of sanctions imposed by the US and its allies are likely to weaken Russia's economy and, more importantly, its defense industrial base in the years ahead, and whether that will in turn affect Russia's ability to rebuild its military forces. And a related question to that is just how badly Russia's forces have been damaged in the war so far. For some, it's taken such a mauling that it no longer represents a military threat beyond its borders and won't for years to come. So I think it's important to also look at that. So I'll make 3 points. First one, what's the likely impact of sanctions on the defense industrial base in the near future? At this stage, it seems clear, as Eddie's pointed out, that the Russian economy is going to be smaller over the next few years than pre-war forecasts would have suggested. Yet despite this shrinking economy, because of this, these elevated export receipts, the Russian state's ability to finance the war and its military remains pretty robust. Looking at the broad picture, as Eddie pointed out, there's a record current account surplus, which in turn is based on a record trade surplus. And this has led in the first quarter to a large federal budget surplus. And all of this could rise even further if commodity prices were to rise as well, even above where they are now. So the Russian state doesn't look as though it's going to run out of funds soon. Indeed, Russian Ministry of Finance data for the first 4 months of the year showed that military spending has doubled what it was intended to do in the budget at the end of last year. And if it remains at this level for the rest of the year, which is a big if, Russia could end up spending anywhere up to 8 to 10% of GDP, because it's going to be spending more on weapons and more on the war and have a smaller economy. And for as long as commodity prices remain high, this looks eminently feasible. Even in the event that Moscow has to run a budget deficit, it's got plenty of fiscal room to do this. It has an extremely low debt level. It doesn't need to borrow abroad. It can borrow from domestic sources of cash. And as I say, at the moment, it has this very positive cash flow. So for as long as the political will is there in the Kremlin, and for as long as export prices remain high, I don't see any immediate financial constraints confronting the Kremlin. Which brings me to the second point. If the money's there, will they be able to use it to replace any lost equipment and to rebuild the military? And many are pinning their hopes on sanctions eroding the defense industry's capacity to produce. But again, I think we should be careful about getting too excited about this. So a number of reasons. Number one, the Russian defense industry has historically always maintained high reserves, large reserves of components. I'd be very surprised if they weren't high on the eve of the war. And therefore, I would imagine that defense industrial enterprises will continue to produce in the months to come. I also wouldn't exaggerate the technological requirements of the defense industry in Russia. We've seen a lot of off-the-shelf Western tech in these systems lost over Ukraine. And we can see that because they've been using it for the whole 8 years that they've been under sanctions, it's not that difficult to source. And that leads me to another point. We shouldn't overstate the efficacy of sanctions. Countries adapt. Combination of espionage, illicit trade through third parties, new trade partners, some targeted import substitution, all of this together is, I think, likely to prevent any sharp collapse in military output. And as I say, looking at the weapons that we've seen used in Ukraine, we can see that a lot of these are using components that were supposed to be sanctioned. So we can see that they've already found ways to circumvent this. There's also certain subsectors of the Russian defense industry that are much more self-sufficient than others. So Russia's ability, for instance, to produce nuclear weapons and their delivery systems has always been very, the self-sufficiency there has always been very high. I wouldn't expect sanctions to affect Russia's ability to build nuclear-powered submarines, ballistic missiles, etc. That takes me to my third and final point. Just how much is Russia going to need to replace, given that it's likely to have the money, and I think its defense industry will continue to perform at least at a reasonably sufficient rate. So much of the analytical coverage so far suggests that Russia has, and Dave pointed out in his opening remarks, that Russia's taken a real mauling, and it's going to take years for Russia to be able to present a military threat to any of its neighbors again. But if we look carefully at the confirmed losses of Russian equipment observed in Ukraine, we see a slightly different picture. And if we use the Oryx data, which I think is the best open source information available on Russian losses. And if we see that as a lower bound for Russian equipment losses, in practice they're probably a bit higher. And we look at the composition, we can see that actually Russia's only lost around 250 tanks, main battle tanks, of the type that have been produced in the last decade. All of the other ones that it's lost, about 550 or so, were all built maybe in the late Soviet period or were modernized in the 1990s. But the really more modern stuff, the T-32B3Ms, the T-90Ms, these have been lost in much smaller numbers. It's not going to take Russia much longer than a year or two to replace this type of equipment. We can illustrate the point by looking at combat aircraft. If we look, according to the Ukrainian MOD, Russia's lost something like 200 combat aircraft. If we look at the Oryx data, we've got a total of 31 confirmed aircraft losses. Of these, 14 would have been Soviet-era aircraft. Only 16 modern, that is produced in the last decade, aircraft have been confirmed as being destroyed. Now, put that in some context. Russia took delivery of around about 400 new combat aircraft over the past decade, along with several hundred more modernized airframes. So Russia's a long way off from having its military capacity completely undermined. And this, of course, informs what it's going to need to rebuild in the future. It's not going to take long to replace lost combat aircraft. It's not going to take long to replace the modern ground equipment. Where Russia's probably going to have to produce harder and run harder is in the realm of PGMs. Russia's used, according to some estimates, as nearly 3,000 long-range PGMs to date. To put that in some context, the United States used about 725 Tomahawks in the early stages of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So Russia's been using these long-range PGMs at the same intensity as the US has in previous wars. So it's normal to use them at this rate in a high-intensity modern war. But they are adjusting accordingly. Only this morning, the Deputy Prime Minister, Yuri Borisov, was talking about the fact that the Votkinsk factory, which produces Iskander, missiles for the Iskander system, has been working 3-shift patterns around the clock. And he's recruiting an extra 500 staff. And we're seeing reports of this all across the defense industry, suggesting, of course, that an absence of components is not yet a problem. So in sum, I'd say that Russia's defense industry might not have as big a job as we think in terms of its need to replenish lost equipment whenever, in the near future. It's going to be able to afford to do this. And we shouldn't underestimate the ability of its industry to adapt to these new and changing circumstances. I'll hand over to you, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And there has been this idea out there that the combination of sanctions and military losses would really cripple Russia's ability to wage this war and maybe other wars in the future. And you've made a pretty convincing case that that may not be the case. I want to turn it over to Mike to sort of pick up where you left off on where the Russian military may be heading. So over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Dave. And great points by Richard. I agree with him that I think the Russian military might rebuild a lot faster than other folks expect. But let me focus on my part of the conversation, which is the actual war. And first, I have to say, we have to take care not to learn the wrong lessons from this war. Russia does not have a Potemkin military. Second, not appreciating the importance of context for how we assess military power, which is very significant because you have to ask not just what do we understand about how Russia's performed in Ukraine, but what does that actually tell us about the future for the Russian military or the military conflicts or scenarios that we might be concerned about? So early conclusions about Russian performance in this war, in my view, overly draw from the first 3 weeks, a bungled regime change operation where Russian forces were not prepared or organized for a serious campaign. Russian forces drove in expecting Ukraine to surrender, thinking they might win within a few days. They took very heavy casualties, lost a lot of their best troops. And on the balance of that equation, between whether it was mostly a bad plan or a bad army, I think it's fair to say that the opening round of the war was more of a bad plan. Much, though far from all of Russia's performance in the early phase of the war can be tied to the peculiarity of this terribly conceived plan and the political assumptions of the leadership. Since then, they have adjusted substantially. Russian forces are now prosecuting the offensive in Ukraine in a manner much closer to how they train and organize the fight. Despite a depleted force, they are making incremental gains, and the war appears likely to become protracted. The Russian military is leveraging fires, air power much more effectively, showing it is better at combined arms than it was in the earlier period of the war. And so we need to really temper those early impressions, right? And we can't get into a place where we tell ourselves that the Russian military is not capable of doing these things and then barely a month later actually seeing them doing a lot of these things that they supposedly can't do, right? Many of the problems in the Russian military, though, are structural. It is very far from just a bad plan. I think we overestimate the Russian military in terms of training, leadership, discipline, and their army has significant deficiencies. One of the biggest ones was a visible difficulty or inability in scaling military operations. What a military can do with 10 battalions and can't necessarily do with 100 or more. So they had very little experience in large-scale military operations and clearly fell flat on that score. But we are also witnessing the Russian military adapt, adjust, and we have to ask, are we assessing them based on where they were on February 23rd, or what that force is likely to look like in the future? And equally, I have to comment, there's considerable overconfidence amongst Western militaries, at least in some circles that I've had the opportunity to engage with, that they would have done tremendously better in a similar scenario. And I'm sorry, but I'm not so sure. We too have not fought a determinate opponent with parity of capability like this in a very long time. So there's a lot of validation and back-patting in Western circles that I don't think is necessarily warranted. Now, for my other point, which is it may be tempting to believe that just because Ukraine has done remarkably well against Russian forces, a NATO victory could be taken for granted in almost any scenario, and it might be an easy fight. That is the wrong lesson to take away from this war, and also that's just not how things work. Military power needs a context to express itself, always. It does not exist in the abstract. It cannot be measured that way. There is no such thing as U.S. is number one, China's number two, and Russia's number three. It all depends on the scenario and the contingency that you're exploring. Poor U.S. military performance in Grenada didn't mean that the United States would lose a conventional war to the Soviet Union in Europe. Poor Soviet performance in the Winter War against Finland in 1939 to 1940 led Germany to draw some of the wrong lessons about the extent of the rot in the Red Army, right? So scenarios dramatically alter your expectations of military performance, and you can't just completely throw away the context of Ukraine and assume that in a different war, a more capable military establishment would have a much easier time. In NATO context, Russian planning would have been very differently, as would the geography of the fight, the logistical challenges for the Russian military, and so forth. A 20% loss of Ukrainian territory in a Baltic context means losing entire countries, or at least an entire country. And if I showed you just a map of how far the Russian military got into Ukraine in the first couple of weeks of the war and laid it over a map of something like the Baltics and Poland, you would walk away with a lot of concerns just based on that very crude and rudimentary comparison. So, in my view, defense communities unfortunately tend not to do nuance well. So we often swing from exaggerating to understating the threat and then back again. Yes, it's true we overestimate the Russian military, but we need to assess things soberly, right? We are still learning a lot about this war. And the early takes, I hate to tell you, are almost always wrong. I know you're thinking that's impossible. All the newly minted Russian military analysts on Twitter, how could they be wrong? And I'm going to tell you that we're actually learning a great deal about the early period of the war that I think suggests that this was far from overdetermined, and a great deal about how Russian military has adjusted in performance in recent weeks. I don't want to oversell that story, but I just want to end by saying there are few things as consistent in foreign policy discourse as writing Russia off as a power, but the old aphorism for me typically holds that Russia's never as strong nor as weak as she looks. Thanks. I'll turn it back over to Dave.
Thanks, Mike, and a helpful reminder to those of us writing about the war that your reactions from the first 2 weeks don't necessarily hold for the entirety of the conflict. And I'll also say that I wish we were doing this in person to see all of you face to face, but between Mike's painting, Richard's cat, and all of your bookshelves, this has actually been quite it's been a visual feast for me as well. Now I want to turn over to Andrea to talk about the political will in Moscow to confront the U.S. And the West.
Great. Okay, well, this has already been such a tremendous panel. I'm really happy to be here. So we've already heard from my fellow panelists about the economic picture, focusing on the effects of sanctions on the economy, also on Russia's defense industrial base and the state of the Russian military. And I think the underlying message there is that Russia still retains many capabilities. And so then the question becomes, what should we expect about Russia's intent or its will to sustain confrontation with the West? And that's what I want to get into and focus on two parts of that question. One is the political international picture, and then I'll turn to the domestic piece. And Dave, as you mentioned in your opening, I think it is a reality that many people have focused on, that Russia is not as isolated as we like to think. Of course, the transatlantic community has been extremely united, but much of the rest of the world is hedging. A lot of countries that have historical relationships with Russia aren't ready to jettison those. Other countries are extremely concerned that high fuel prices and food prices is going to cause instability within their countries. And Russia, for its part, is really going to very great lengths to control the narrative and to frame the United States and Europe as to blame for this war, and that the United States and Europe are to blame for the sanctions. I've even heard anecdotally from senior U.S. officials in some of the meetings that they've had with counterparts in some African countries that they've been asked about, what about those chemical weapons facilities in Ukraine? So the point is that clearly Russian disinformation is extremely pervasive. And Russia is also working to flip the script. The Kremlin, for example, said that they would allow grain to leave Ukraine if the West removed some of the sanctions. So again, that leaves many countries blaming the United States and Europe. And by the way, as Russia works to control how other countries are understanding this war, they have the support of China, who largely echoes these Kremlin talking points. And so for me, on this international piece, the point really is that Russia is not as isolated as we like to think. And this creates a more permissive environment for Russia to really stay the course in terms of its intentions to undermine the United States and the West. Now, to speak about those intentions, of course, looking at the domestic piece, of course, this war is having a very significant impact on Russia's domestic politics. I would say it's difficult for me to imagine a Russia coming out of this war that is anything but intent on sustaining its confrontation with the West. And I think one of the dynamics I find very notable is the way that the Kremlin has unleashed this torrent of ultra-nationalist rhetoric to whip up support for the war. You have Putin openly talking about national traitors, the need to cleanse them from society, and there has been, to some degree, a receptive audience for those narratives. This war has become a great patriotic war that a large segment of Russian society stands behind and supports. It is, of course, difficult to assess true Russian sentiment when the Kremlin has increased repression so dramatically. There is polling, though, that shows, there has been an uptick in support for Putin from 71% to 83% now, most recently in May. I take the analytic point that polling in these highly repressive regimes is problematic, but I think it's safe to say that there is a sizable segment of the Russian population that supports the war, in large part because the state media and Kremlin propaganda convinces them of their ideas. And so I think for me, the point is we can't overlook the Kremlin's ability to control the narrative inside Russia. And that's problematic because now you have a President Putin who is likening himself to Peter the Great. It was just this week, it was marking the 350th anniversary of Peter the Great, that Putin is out there saying that Peter the Great wasn't taking anything, he was taking it back. And he added to that it is our responsibility also to take back and to strengthen. And I think that's how Putin sees his mission. It's to take back and to claim what was once Russian. And so here, again, a Russia that is weakened in this war is not a less dangerous Russia. Putin will retain the intent to challenge the West so long as he is there. And we can talk about this in Q&A, but I would say there's very few signs that he's at risk of losing power anytime soon. The final point I want to make, of course, is that's not the only plausible scenario, and it's not impossible to imagine that this war could precipitate an earlier than expected departure for Putin. I would say Putin's hold on power, although it is secure, is considerably weaker now than it was prior to the conflict. And so I don't want to necessarily overstate public support for the war, because there is quite clearly a segment of society who opposes it, but who can't, because of the repression, vocalize their opposition. So to talk about, but what does that mean over the longer term? And I would say unfortunately, that there's a strong chance that even in a post-Putin world, that many of the contours of Russian foreign policy will persist. And I say that after looking at a lot of leadership changes in countries that look like Russia, where you've had these autocrats in power 20 years or more. In 75% of cases, most like Russia, authoritarianism persists beyond the departure of the leader. And I would say that we would be likely to even see the same regime persist in Russia in cases in which Putin dies in office, or if you see some sort of elite transfer. And in both of those cases, it's someone from within the same ruling elite that would likely emerge as Russia's next leader. And I think so long as that regime persists, my expectation is then that the contours of Russian foreign policy persist along with it. There are other scenarios. It's possible that the regime could fall with Putin and that you could see more meaningful change in leadership. It's also possible that even a new leader from the same regime could at least lead to a change in tone in relations with Russia. And, we saw that for a time when Medvedev was at the helm there for a while. So, of course, those more optimistic outcomes are possible, but I think it's important that we're realistic that they are lower probability outcomes and that we do need to be prepared for a long-term confrontation with Russia, along with, I think, lasting capabilities that my colleagues talked about. So back over to you, Dave.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrea. And I think you put your finger on an important point, which is that even if we're counting tanks and GDP after this war, during this war, and Russia is numerically weaker, it doesn't necessarily mean Russia's less dangerous. It does depend on decision-making in the Kremlin, right? Please keep the audience questions coming. By the way, we've got several, and I said at the beginning that I was going to integrate as many of them as I could. So to show I'm serious about that, I'll go straight to a question from Rachel, who has a question for Eddie. She asks, could you comment on the mechanisms to cut the price, I assume that's of oil, and how best to bring on board countries that are wary of Western policies? And I'll layer another question on top of that, Eddie. There's this idea out there that this war is going to make Russia more reliant on China, certainly economically. Are we seeing that happen already? What's your read on the China piece to Rachel's question as well? So over to you, Eddie.
Sure. Thanks, Dave, and Rachel, thanks for the question. So before answering that, I just want to dovetail on something Andrea said, which is that undoubtedly Russia will emerge from this conflict with strong intent to continue challenging the West. I think we're past the point of trying to change Putin's calculus or psychology about the wisdom of challenging the West. Clearly, that is going to be really continue to be the centerpiece of his claims to domestic legitimacy, being the kind of Russian ruler standing up to aggressive forces in the West. So I think what that means is that we need to think about sanctions less in terms of how they can affect Putin's psychology, which unfortunately I think is a fool's errand. But really we need to sort of think in terms of a more pedestrian goal of degrading Russian capabilities. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin took some flack by saying that, one of our goals was to weaken Russia. But I think in that comment was a real kernel of truth. And that's really what we're left with right now. So onto your question on the price cap, the point of trying to curtail Russian export revenues is, to sort of, to go into what Richard said, is to make it harder for Russia to kind of have its cake and eat it too, to fund government salaries, to pay pensions, to keep afloat industries that are really there just because of state support, as well as paying for its military capabilities, right? So I think that forcing Putin to make those hard choices is really important, and that's why you do a price cap. So how would this work? There's really two components. The first is the West would come out and basically state a price for oil, say $30 a barrel. You could choose anything really, that's close to Russia's marginal cost of production. And then what you would do is you would have two prongs of sanctions. One would be primary sanctions. So the US and the EU would prohibit Western companies from providing shipping, insurance, port services, et cetera, to cargoes of Russian oil that exceed the price cap. So for instance, if a tanker of Russian oil was being sent to China for a price that exceeded that cap, and a US company or a British company was providing insurance for that tanker, that would be illegal, right? So there would be significant risk in sort of added to shipments of Russian oil. And then secondly, you would actually threaten secondary sanctions against buyers of Russian oil cargoes that exceed the price cap. So in this instance, again, perhaps the Chinese bank who's processing the payment for the cargo of Russian oil that exceeds the cap would be sanctioned. I think the important thing here in terms of how to bring others on board is that the negative incentive, the threat of sanctions here, is actually not the most salient point. It's actually the positive incentive. It's the positive incentive for countries like China, India, and Turkey to buy Russian oil at a steep discount, to sort of lock in and potentially increase some of the discounts they've already been able to get in recent months. So, I think it's important to note that China, India, Turkey, others are not buying Russian oil out of charity. They're not doing this because they love Putin and they want to, throw a lifeline to Putin. They're doing it because they think it's in their economic interest. And frankly, they're getting Russian oil at a discount. So this price cap maneuver, the reason I'm personally in favor of it is it actually provides a significant positive incentive for China, India, and Turkey to comply with this price cap. And we actually saw last month, the Indians have been driving really hard bargains with the Russians, trying to lock in prices as low as $70 a barrel, while Brent right now is trading at over $120 a barrel. So I think that's how it would work mechanically. From a practical standpoint, you really only need the U.S. to be on board. It would sort of a nice to have the EU on board, but not strictly necessary from the point of sanctions, because this would be ultimately enforced by financial sanctions. And as we've seen in the past, really unilateralism is okay and is sufficient. When the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the JCPOA and reinstated similar secondary oil sanctions against Iran, it worked as well as you could have expected. Iranian oil exports really collapsed. So in terms of China, just quickly touching on that, I do think that we have to be honest with ourselves that the combination of this war and the sanctions is pushing Russia and China more closely together. What it really is doing is it's making Russia more dependent on China, because now if Russia were to lose the Chinese market, there's really nowhere else to turn. So I do think that's a negative sort of externality of the Western response to the war. But I would caveat that this has been happening now for quite some time, right? Russia-China relations have gotten much closer since the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine, and their economic ties have grown substantially since then. So I think this just kind of locks in a trend that was already taking place.
Got it. Thanks, Eddie. And Richard, I want to turn to you for, first of all, I'd be interested in your response to Eddie's comments on sanctions, but also in your opening, you laid out quite a strong counter argument to all of the various things where we think Russia might be weaker than it actually is. Where do you see the vulnerabilities in the Russian economy and defense industrial base? Are there really areas where they are vulnerable coming out of those wars? So over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Dave. Eddie's highlighted the main vulnerability insofar as that's Russia's dependence on hydrocarbon export revenues to fund the entire edifice in the Russian economy. There are lots of non-hydrocarbon firms that rely on the revenues generated by the sale, the export of oil, gas, and other metals and minerals for their survival, because these revenues get redistributed around the economy by the leadership. So if there is a way, and Eddie's just outlined, I think, some quite plausible, although not ones without potential problems, but he's nevertheless put forward, I think, some quite plausible proposals for how you would try to use that dependence on hydrocarbons to against them. So that's one thing. If you can reduce the revenues available, then you can have an impact on the wider economy, because as Eddie pointed out, you force them, the leadership, to deal with scarcity. If your resources are relatively scarce, you have to prioritize. And if there's a war going on and you want to allocate your resources towards the military and you want to spend more on, let's say, rearmament, then that leaves fewer funds available for spending on health, education, supporting the economy in the face of what is, by all accounts, going to be a pretty sharp and severe recession. So that's the first vulnerability, the biggest one. The problem with it, of course, is that it is a sort of a double-edged sword, insofar as some of the things that we might do in order to be able to reduce Russia's hydrocarbon revenues can, in fact, have the unintended consequences of pushing them up, at least in the short run. Personally, whenever I get asked this question, I always think the most obvious response, and it's not one that I know some people would be happy with, would be to increase pumping oil as much as you possibly can. Convince the Saudis to do it as much as they can. convince US private producers to do it as much as they can. If you could do that, you would see oil prices come down, especially given that high prices lately, I think, will cause some demand destruction in the medium term. By that, I mean possibly even in a few months. So if you could disrupt the supply-demand balance and take prices lower, and then, as Eddie pointed out, Russian oil is already trading at discount, then that, I think, is the way that you do it. But again, and Eddie made this point, it means prioritizing weakening Russia over other policy objectives, such as moving towards a greener economy. And that's something that, of course, has to be taken into account. So we live in a world where policymakers have multiple objectives, not just dealing with Russia. The second primary principal weakness, and certainly insofar as the defense industry is concerned, has been this dependence on components. Electronic components, machine tools used in the production of goods across the defense industry, but also across Russian manufacturing more broadly. And that's where Russia's experienced the biggest hit so far. You know, that's where most of this sharp decline in imports is manifested. So if there is a way to make sure that Russia is unable to purchase, acquire in whatever way, alternatives to those components that it's no longer accessing from the West, then that, I think, will be a good thing. Because even if the Russians can circumvent the sanctions, it's going to impose a cost. And that cost means that, you know, for every component that they have to pay 50% more, then, you know, it again imposes resource constraints. Again, though, and that was the point in my presentation, we also have to be quite, I think, realistic about just how much heavy lifting sanctions can do on this front. There are multiple ways in which countries adapt, not necessarily to a new optimal future, but countries nevertheless adapt to pretty heavy sanctions. South Africa, Iran, even North Korea continues in the way in which it does, with the same regime, doing the things that we countries wanted it not to do. And they are much smaller countries with a much less diverse manufacturing base than Russia. You have to bear in mind, for all Russia's manufacturing weaknesses, and for the fact that it's supposed to be a gas station with missiles, it remains one of the world's top 10 producers in dollar terms of manufactured goods. So again, we have to be realistic about what we're expecting from sanctions. I think they play a vital role in statecraft and in our policy towards Russia. And as Eddie pointed out, I think they're likely to impose a growing cost over time. But expecting that they're going to suddenly result in Russian defense firms not being able to produce, you know, in the next coming weeks or months, I think is entirely implausible. We've seen people pointing to, you know, sort of dubious media reports of Russian defense plants not being able to produce. This was within the first few days of the war, and I just, you know, pulled what little hair I have left out of my head and thought, there's no way that we're going to be able to have that sort of impact that quickly. We should be looking more to the medium to long run here if we are to exploit these vulnerabilities. And it all has to be done in a joined up way. And that isn't always happening, I think, at the moment. Sometimes we're doing some things with one hand that actually reduces our ability to do things with the other.
Can I add one really quick point? Because Richard raises a really important thing that I was hoping would come up in our panel, and that is like the story of adaptation. One of the things that Mike and Richard and I are working on, and some of the work that we're doing, is kind of thinking through then the more kind of vulnerable that Russia feels in terms of its conventional capabilities, the more we're likely to see the Kremlin double down on a lot of the asymmetric tools that it includes, or that it has in its arsenal, including cyber and especially the nuclear piece. And I invite Mike and Richard again to kind of comment on that. But again, it's this idea that even though Russia may be, many of its conventional forces may be deteriorated, a lot of the things that that U.S. defense planners worry about most, whether it's the nuclear weapons, integrated air defense subs that Mike talked about, those have been largely untouched by the war. And again, the more Russia feels concerned or about its conventional capabilities, I think the more that they are going to double down and rely on the nuclear deterrence and potentially escalation piece. And that's something that U.S. and NATO defense planners need to be thinking a lot about. And it gets back to that idea, down but not out. Weaken Russia is not necessarily a less dangerous one, because it does have these other tools in its toolkit that it can still rely on.
Great. And Andrea, you actually just addressed a question we got from Vanessa, which was if Russia's conventional military or defense industrial base is weakened, what could they turn to if they feel threatened? What are the, and nuclear is an issue that she raised. Mike, I'll turn to you with that, but I also want to layer in a question from Michelle, which was, what can the U.S. military planners take away from the war so far? I know you gave us a good talking to about not drawing conclusions too early in the war early on, so that may still be in play in your answer. But, you know, if you were sitting in the Pentagon, what should people be learning from how Russia has fought this war so far?
Sure, that's a good question. So, yeah, I'd say at the end of the day, force employment matters more so than capability on paper. And one of the hardest lessons of this is that qualitative and quantitative superiority on paper is not necessarily definitive of outcomes. I mean, one of the things I've learned is that we have challenges too, in a lot of the areas where I see Russian military have problems. And we, the United States, but particularly Europeans, are not necessarily set up for a sustained great power war. If you look at the rate of attrition and you look at the amount of munitions being used, NATO's already out of a lot of key munitions that it provided to Ukraine that will take years to replace. And this is not a war that NATO's in, but it is a, it is a war in which European countries and the United States are materially contributing to. And if you look at the way we tend to think about, I think, warfighting scenarios, they're often very much tied to the operational level and not thinking through the likelihood that these kind of wars become protracted. There is no early on culminating point. There's a huge amount of attrition. Militaries try to see their way through the conflict when their assumptions are proven wrong. They adapt over time, and wars never, well, I won't say never, it's a terrible word, but they rarely end the way they begin, right? So you can't use straight line analysis and assume that the war is going to continue going on the way it has. And this conflict is great evidence of that. So there's much here to ponder, just in general, in how we think about defense planning, about our own requirements. I think the wrong takeaway is always to think that, oh, well, the Russian military is not good conventionally. The real problem is going to be nuclear weapons moving forward. And folks will want to sort of focus on China just because it's a natural intellectual proclivity. I'll tell you that in many ways is the wrong takeaway, and history consistently proves that's the wrong takeaway. And then the last question, I think that the earlier person, Vanessa, had, yes, so beyond conventional military capability, right, Russia also has a very diverse arsenal of theater nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, anti-satellite capabilities, offensive cyber capabilities, which may be the dog that didn't bark in this conflict, but I strongly discourage people from subscribing to the school of analysis that says just because you haven't seen somebody use something yet, it means that they either don't have it or can't do it, right? And cyber is one of those areas where I encourage sober assessment, considering that there's still a lot we haven't seen there that could happen. So there's a whole host of other capabilities that Russia has that have not been diminished by this conflict or haven't even been used in it, or that this particular war is not necessarily representative of what that would look like in a context of a fight, let's say, between Russia and NATO. Just I encourage those kind of trying to balance that conversation a bit more.
A quick follow-up, Mike, on you mentioned cyber. Many of us were writing that if this invasion happened, it would likely be simultaneous, military invasion and massive cyber intervention by Russia. It didn't happen that way, or at least on the scale that people expected. Quickly, what do you draw? Do you draw any conclusions from that, or why do you think it may be that we haven't seen Russia use cyber capabilities in Ukraine on a massive scale?
So in general, I think what we got wrong is that the Russian invasion was not a combined arms operation oriented to the Ukrainian military, right? The kind of campaign that, let's say, NATO might organize. It was really meant as a regime change operation where they expected to win very quickly for the Ukrainian military and political leadership to surrender. And the question as to why we haven't seen some of these cyber capabilities. Well, I can only speculate. Obviously, I do not know, and we always have to be honest about the things we don't know. One reason could be the same reason we didn't see an organized air power campaign to attain air superiority or a sustained strike campaign. Russia used very few of its precision-guided munitions in the early days, although by now they've used thousands, because they didn't actually intend a sustained campaign like this. Another reason is because very likely they intended an occupation to begin within days, and they didn't want to damage and destroy the critical infrastructure that they would need to run the country they thought they were going to take over, right, relatively easily, okay? And there are other reasons potentially as well. Maybe they wanted to hold in reserve and not use a lot of these cards, and to have them in reserve and not tip their hand in terms of what they can do vis-a-vis NATO. I don't know. I'm simply offering the potential reasons, right? We're still figuring out a lot about the early part of the war, and we're discovering much more about those early days and weeks of who did what and how things unfolded that now give us a better picture than the initial takes, right? And that's unfortunately how history works. And I often have very disappointing answers for folks because I tell them, listen, we're still debating about what happened in World War I. So you have to moderate your expectations 100 days into this war into assuming that we might have all the answers about how things unfolded in the early weeks. And I think we are seeing much more, some of those capabilities in play much more now.
Got it. And Andrea, I want to circle back to you. You raised Russia's nuclear arsenal, as did Vanessa in her question. In what ways does that constrain the way that the U.S., both responds to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but U.S. policy toward Russia, on a broader scale, the fear that at some point Russia nuclear weapons could be in play when it comes to Russia?
I think that's something that's still being widely debated within the administration. I think it's certainly, one of the primary reasons why this administration has been so careful about entering into a direct military confrontation with Russia, right? That I think has been, for this administration, one of the overarching principles as it's making decisions about how far they want to go in terms of providing Ukraine with the arms that they are asking for. That imperative to avoid a direct military confrontation, in large part given that Russia is a nuclear-powered state and that, it is very likely that if we got into a confrontation, it could very quickly escalate to that nuclear level. It's something that we're also debating in the analytic community. So what if, for example, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not Putin could turn to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in this war, either to try to dissuade greater Western support, and how would the United States and the West respond? I think my sense is that certainly if Putin used, if it was something for demonstration effect, kind of a high altitude test, I think that there would be a lot of voices advocating that the United States should not be deterred in that situation and that we would proceed. We would look for opportunities, and President Biden has said as much, that there would be, I think he said a symmetric response, but I don't think that's what he actually meant, but that the United States would respond in some appropriate fashion, and that we would consider doing what it is that we needed to do in order to support Ukraine in that case. Because there's an imperative to demonstrate that nuclear weapons can't dissuade us in certain instances, right? So it's obviously a fine line. I think it's a big question that's going to be extremely relevant moving forward, for the reason that we've talked about, that if Russia is damaged and is feeling wounded conventionally, then the nuclear threat, the potential of escalation and use in some sort of military confrontation, the nuclear piece, I think, takes on outsized importance for the Kremlin. As they, for example, are using up precision-guided, their PGMs, that I think, again, would potentially shorten the pathway to nuclear war. I think these are all the things that defense planners, both in the United States and NATO, need to be contemplating about how we would respond, A, to that nuclear use, and to a Kremlin that might be more reliant on that in the future. And I imagine those discussions are happening at NATO and in other places.
Got it. And we now have about 5 minutes left. Thank you for all these questions that are coming in. I'll try to squeeze a couple of them in. Eddie, I'll turn to you with John's questions. What are some ways to further delegitimize Putin's grip on power? Obviously, this is a crucial question and a hard one to answer, but I want to ask you in the sanctions context, because we've heard some analysts inside Russia, or in some cases newly outside of Russia, say that actually the more you sanction Russia, the more resentment of the West grows inside Russia, and actually that can help Putin's domestic position. Do you worry about that?
Yeah, I think with sanctions, you always worry about a rally around the flag effect, right? I think that oftentimes there is sort of an effort, almost always there's an effort internally for governments to blame sanctions on external actors, and as opposed to saying, hey, we invaded Ukraine and that's why there are now sanctions on you, you blame it on the West. And I think so far that's working in Russia, and that's normal, right? Normally when sanctions are first imposed, the blame oftentimes goes on the sender of the sanctions. I think the real question is what happens over time, right? I think in 2014, we saw a similar spike in Putin's popularity after the annexation of Crimea, but that popularity softened quite a bit in the coming years when the Russian economy moved into recession. You saw standards of living decrease pretty substantially. This was also a period of lower oil prices. So I think what I'll be looking for really is, to what extent, especially over time, if this war does kind of ossify into a war of attrition, that Putin, doesn't really have any major victory to claim, I do think that you're going to see Russian living standards suffer considerably. You will see growing unemployment, growing inflation. And, I think it's going to be hard over time for Putin, who, I'll remind you, his first claim to power wasn't, to be the next Peter the Great. It was, to stabilize Russia after a very chaotic 1990s in which, we did see standards of living decrease from what they were in the Soviet times, right? And so if that is erased, if sort of the bump in living standards that Putin delivered from sort of 2000 when he came into power to present, if that is erased in the coming years, I do think that Putin will struggle to retain domestic legitimacy. I don't think that he can maintain popular support in Russia just by fanning the flames of irredentis nationalism indefinitely.
Got it. And Richard, I'll turn to you with this question as well. I know we only have a few minutes left here, but should policymakers be thinking about how to weaken Putin's hold on power? And if they are, do we actually know what might be effective in that regard?
I don't know about whether they ought to or they ought not. I mean, I think that's, I think it's pretty evident that people are trying to. Now, whether or not we know the levers to pull in order to make that happen, I think is a very different question. As Eddie pointed out, then if we take living standards over the last decade, they've barely grown. Now, that's for a number of homegrown Russian reasons, but it will have sanctions will have played some part in that, and certainly over the course of the near future may play an even larger role in restricting Russian living standards, restricting the availability of goods and services to the average Russian, etc. The question is this politically important? Is this going to be enough to cause people to express their dissatisfaction to the regime and ask for something to change, i.e. for that regime to either change its policy or to step aside and let somebody else in? Again, to Andrea's point earlier about the methodology, the problems when you're looking at public opinion poll data, but my sense is that the key constituencies that support Putin remain pretty much in place, and that despite sanctions and despite external pressure, what they'll do is use fewer resources, a smaller resource pie, and just make sure that they allocate them towards those key constituencies that keep the regime in place. So that means the costs will be borne by the people who look to the West, by the people who spoke, several languages, traveled to New York and London a lot, who maybe had property abroad. They're the people who are going to suffer the most and are suffering the most. But I think, for those people working in the sort of more industrial towns who would vote for Putin and United Russia, I think that the regime will do enough to keep these people on side. So I think you'd have to use a lot of levers beyond what we've already discussed to even get to a point where their lives become so bad that they want to come out in the streets and complain. So I'm quite skeptical as to what levers can be used to achieve that effect, at least in the in the foreseeable future.
And I think skeptical is perhaps the right word to describe all of our panelists' reaction to this narrative that we were talking about, this idea that Russia would emerge from this war severely weakened, less of a threat to the West, an economic basket case, maybe even a political time bomb. I think we heard some very strong counterpoints across all of those various areas. I have many more questions. Our audience has many more questions that I unfortunately didn't get to, but in the interest of finishing on time, as we said, I'm going to unfortunately have to wrap it up. Thanks so much to Eddie, Richard, Andrea, and Mike for their wonderful and very insightful commentary. And thank you again to CNAS for holding this panel and for bringing Axios on board as the media partner. Our next panel will be Tech Matters. That will begin at 12:30. So maybe get yourself some lunch if you're on the East Coast and come back and join us in 30 minutes for another great discussion. And thanks again to all of you in the audience for engaging and for your great questions as well. So that's it from us on the Russia panel.